Hey everyone, welcome to Games Are Fun. My name is Luke Armstrong. I am your host, and welcome back to the show after nearly 4.5 years of being on a hiatus. Games Are Fun is officially back. So welcome, man. It has been a long time since some of you have listened to the show, but it has been a long time since I've recorded a podcast. So lots of rust to shake off, but I'm really excited to be back behind a microphone and recording a podcast for you. Today is April 20th, 2026, and today's episode is going to be about what happened to the podcast, what's happened these past 5 years, and why has Games Are Fun returned in 2026. I thought it would be really fun to kind of just do a little bit of a recap of Games Are Fun, maybe share some memories from that original run of the show, and then to kind of go into talking about why the podcast ended and, what is planned for the future of Games Are Fun. So if this is your first time checking out the show, welcome in. It's great to have you here. And if you're a returning listener, thanks for coming back and supporting the show. It means a lot that you decided to come back after all these years and listen to what I have to say. So the first place I wanted to jump into today is kind of just going back in time and talking about that original run of Games Are Fun. So Games Are Fun was a weekly video game podcast. It ran from 2018 to 2021, and now it's back, 2026. The show initially started as just a solo podcast where I was just in my spare bedroom with a microphone and my laptop, and I would hit record and I would just talk about video games. It was kind of like a creative outlet for me to talk about all the things I love about video games and to kind of get into the weeds about some of the more nerdy things that, you don't necessarily talk about with everybody on a daily basis in terms of games, because it's like, really nerdy stuff that only really big video game enthusiasts care about, I guess. And so that's kind of where the podcast started. And it was this solo show that eventually evolved into having some co-hosts. Garrett Neely, Adam Beagle, and Steven Beagle eventually joined the show. And we basically would join together once a week and talk about video games. We'd cover a lot of video game news, trending industry topics. And we'd also talk about what games we've been playing. We'd give video game reviews, anything from AAA titles all the way down to indies. And just in general, it was a really fun show to record because, we never had to cover a specific thing each week. It was kind of just pick something out of the hat, and that's what we talked about that week. So it ran from 2018 to 2021. It was about 127 episodes. And then all of a sudden, the podcast just kind of came to a stop. I don't even remember how the announcement was shared, because if I remember correctly, the last episode of Games Are Fun was actually recorded just by Steven. I think it was a Steven solo episode. And it was just kind of decided that the podcast was going on a hiatus and kind of stopping production for the time being. And I think at that point in time, I knew that the podcast was going to return at some point, but I didn't know when it was going to return. I thought maybe, in 2022, it might make a comeback. And time went on, and it got to a point where, here we are almost 5 years later, and this is the first episode back. So it feels great to be back, but it to be completely honest with you, I did not expect it to be this long before I recorded another episode of the show. And in that time, while the podcast was away, I thought about it a lot, obviously. It was a part of my life for, almost 4 years, and I missed doing it, and I missed a lot of the connections that I made from recording the podcast. Back in the day when we recorded the podcast, we had the Discord channel that kind of accompanied the show, and there was a lot of people that kind of continued the conversations we had on the show on Discord, and we kind of created this small community of people that would come together and talk about video games and kind of be a part of each other's lives. And what's really cool is some of those connections I made, not just with like my co-hosts, Garrett, Adam, and Steven, but some of the people that listen to the show, still stay in touch with me and still talk about games with me. And so I kind of miss those connections of being able to talk about games and have you guys, the listeners, listening to them and kind of engage with it, whether it was writing in to our weekly question of the week, or coming into a Discord, or dropping by a live stream on Twitch and joining in on the conversation. It was a lot of fun. And that was definitely the highlight of the show for me, is just like the connections I made with all the people involved. And I really miss that. And that's kind of a big reason why Games Are Fun is finally come back. I spent a lot of time kind of figuring out if I was going to come back as Games Are Fun, or if I was going to brand the show as something new. But ultimately I decided, that same sentence still stands. Games are fun. Or I guess it's not a sentence. I don't know, how many words do you need to be considered a sentence? It's a phrase, right? Games are fun. We all believe it here. And that hasn't changed. I still play lots of video games, maybe not to the same level I did 5 years ago, but I'm still very much have a love for all things games. And that's what Games Are Fun is going to be about moving forward. It's going to be a weekly podcast that talks about games. And, it's not necessarily even going to be exclusively about video games. It could sometimes maybe go into trading card games or board games, or just other general games. Really, I'm not kind of just keeping it to video games, because right in the title, it's Games Are Fun. And so that's kind of the heart of the show, and that's what this show is going to be. But before I talk more in depth about what Games Are Fun is going to look like in 2026, I kind of wanted to go back and talk about, that original run of the podcast and why it ended, and kind of what I'd been up to these last 5 years. So the podcast started, like I said, in 2018. It was just this solo show. And I think when I started the podcast, I didn't really have any sort of direction on where it was going to go, or what my overall goal of the show was, other than that it was a creative outlet for me. And I think within time of recording the podcast, and as I got more comfortable behind a microphone, and as I also had built up this confidence, especially with having like Adam and Garrett and Steven on the show, it kind of turned into something where we found a great rhythm. Listening to the later episodes of Games Are Fun today, I'm like, wow, we really, it's actually funny. Garrett sent me a message, and he said, I was listening to the last episode I was on, and we actually knew what we were talking about back in the day. It wasn't like totally amateur hour. And I couldn't agree more with him. I listened to the first episode that I recorded recently, and it was E3 2018 predictions. And even in that show, I was quite impressed with how long I could carry on a conversation by myself and just talk about video game predictions for this video game conference show. But the one thing I realized in listening to that episode is I didn't really have a sense on who I was talking to, because it was this show that was just a creative outlet. And so I didn't really know if anyone would listen to it. And I kind of just assumed the only support I would get was from close friends and family. And a lot of the times I would be talking about video games in a way that I almost had to like filter myself in a way that, oh, I don't know if like my friends who are, they like video games, but they don't really care about like E3 or like video game developers and having industry conversations and stuff like that. So I felt like I constantly had to like filter myself in those early episodes. And then as the show grew and we built an audience, and I kind of decided, hey, people are coming to the show not necessarily to get video game news and hear the breaking titles. They can go to a million places for that. They're coming to the show to kind of hear what we have to say, what our commentary is on these topics, and to just kind of be part of the conversation. And I think coming back to the podcast in 2026, that's kind of the fun thing in this, is I know that I don't have anything to like kind of prove out of the gate. I kind of know what this show is and what it can be, and it's all just about having fun with it. And so through that run 2018 to 2021, there were so many big highlights of doing the show. Obviously, bringing on Adam and Garrett and Steven were a huge highlight of just being able to share those conversations with those guys and, you know, talk to those guys on a daily basis about things and planning content and coming up with show ideas was a lot of fun. And, you know, that was really cool to kind of just see all these heads come together and kind of build something and build that community. And yeah, I think about like the Extra Life charity stream that we did where we raised like a bunch of money for charity, and we had our like marathon 12-hour stream or something like that on Twitch. And I think about doing like the 2.5, 3 hour video game reviews for like The Last of Us Part 2 and Death Stranding and Final Fantasy VII Remake, and just how fun it was to just gush about these awesome video games. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. And so you might have asked yourself, you know, what happened? Why did the show stop? And I think I kind of wanted to kind of talk about where I was in 2021 and kind of provide some context to you guys, the listeners, on what was going on behind the scenes, at least with me, and kind of why the show needed to be put on pause. So I will say that, you know, the biggest thing with recording the podcast was it was always fun. It never felt like it was a huge amount of work to do. It was like just this fun creative outlet. And especially once we had 4 people on the show, I could kind of lean on Garrett and Adam and Steven to also run the show and lead things. And that took a lot of pressure off of me, which was great. But in 2021, you know, you're in the midst of COVID. I kind of low-key had like a mental breakdown, honestly. And I could go into the details of why that happened and everything, but that's not why I'm here today. I just kind of wanted to summarize that, you know, I was dealing with anxiety. I have a generalized anxiety disorder, and just living daily life was a bit of a challenge. And trying to do that while also do this extracurricular activity of recording a, you know, 1.5 hour long podcast on top of it just felt like way too much for me at the time. And so it got to a point where I just decided, you know, I need to take a break from this. It's just too much on my mind to kind of constantly be thinking about this every week, coming up with a new show idea or new content to talk about, when I was just, you know, struggling to like get out of bed each day, honestly. And so, yeah, it just got to a point where I needed to put on pause. And I think I was quite open about this with, you know, Adam, Garrett, and Steven, and they were all very supportive of that, which was really helpful at the time. You know, those guys obviously enjoyed doing the show as well. And so to kind of like, hey, cut that off, and they no longer have that kind of platform to talk about games. I'm sure it was kind of a bit of bummer to them, but they were really understanding. And, you know, even to this day, I'm still talk to those guys frequently, and we're still very much a part of each other's lives. And yeah, that's kind of ultimately why I decided I needed to stop the show. And I was hoping that I would spend some time and get to a better place where I could record the show again. But to be completely honest with you, you know, I've struggled with my anxiety for quite a few years. And from like 2021 till like late 2023, early 2024 is when I finally felt like I had a bit more stability in my life. And that was a challenge. You know, I spent a lot of time trying to help fix my situation, you know, seeing a therapist on a weekly basis, and just a whole plethora of other coping strategies and learning about different things. And like I said, going to counseling and in some cases like needing medication to help myself. And it was a struggle. And it still is a struggle today, to be completely honest with you. But for the last few years, I've had a lot more stability in my life. And once that stability came back, I kind of thought about, I'd really like to create content again. And I spent like literally since 2024, like thinking about how I could do that again in a way that made sense. And I'm good friends with Garrett, and I would message him about this and kind of brainstorm ideas with him. And there's lots of different ideas over the years. I got back into collecting Yu-Gi-Oh cards and Pokemon cards, and so him and I had explored ideas of creating content around that, and like opening packs and having kind of a TCG focused channel and stuff like that. And that never really materialized too much. And I got back into doing some Twitch streaming after hitting like a peak in terms of like my streaming career during COVID. And that was kind of hard. Like I didn't really have a lot of passion in that. And then I kind of explored the idea of like, okay, well, I want to do a podcast again. Maybe it's not a video game podcast. And after all this kind of thinking, I always would come back to the idea that, what, games are fun, was a lot of fun to record and do. And why don't I just come back and just continue that on? Just have these conversations on a weekly basis about video games and see where it takes us. And so that's basically what Games Are Fun is going to be moving forward. It's that same show of talking about video games and not necessarily sticking to a script or weekly segments, but just like kind of being more open-ended about it and broad with the show. There might be even some episodes where I talk more about myself than I actually talk about video games, such as this episode right now. But all of that will kind of be explored in the future, and I'm really excited to kind of see where that goes. So I did also want to kind of give a bit of an update on where have I been in the last 5 years? So, because I've had some major life changes that I wanted to share. And the biggest is the last episode I recorded of Games Are Fun podcast, I was living in Edmonton at the time. I've since moved to Vancouver Island. I moved to Vancouver Island back in 2022. I worked at a skate and surf shop for a few years, and that was a lot of fun. I'm now living in Victoria on the island, and kind of working in marketing and communications and having a lot of fun with that. And yeah, like I said, now that I had the stability, I kind of wanted to talk about video games again and talk about games. And a lot has changed since 2021. Obviously, in 2021, we were like, coming up to that year point, I think, on the podcast of like the first year anniversary of PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X and this new generation of gaming. And man, so much has changed since then in terms of like the gaming landscape and the industry. And it's like a totally different place now. I think the biggest thing is gaming is like it's an expensive hobby nowadays, right? With how much money not only games cost these days, but like the rising cost for consoles is crazy. Even just building a PC, I think it was cheaper to build a PC back when I did it in 2020 or whatever year that was, and I probably would be paying more if I did that today. And so it's a bit of a different landscape. And so I've kind of thought about some of these things in returning to the show and how that might change some of my perspectives on video games. And I'm not buying multiple games a year anymore. I'm really budgeting because games can cost almost $100 Canadian, and when games cost that much, you really have to decide, okay, is this a game that I'm willing to spend money on? And yeah, the other thing that I've kind of noticed is just like there's so much out there, and so I've kind of like worried about what is this show going to be like in compared to other video game podcasts. And I've kind of put my pressure on myself, and I remember putting pressure on myself during like the original run of like, we need to compete with all these other shows. And it's like, well, no, there's like thousands and thousands of podcasts out there. There's tons of YouTube channels. There's tons of streamers. There's so much content that you can go and find if you want to watch something related to a game you like. And so really this show is just going to be about my takes on video games. It's going to go back to being that solo show, at least to begin with. I obviously plan on bringing guests on in the future and stuff, but the podcast is going to kind of just be this like kind of open conversations about whatever I want to talk about that this week. And, like this first episode back, I kind of just want to talk about me and where I've been. And so, yeah, that's kind of where my head's at. And it's hard not to kind of overthink this completely in terms of like trying to nail down like an identity for this podcast. And really, I think I just want to like let that all come naturally and just kind of like in certain aspects it did back in the day in its original run. So yeah, I can't tell you like a year from now like where games are fun will be, if it's like more focused on one thing over another, but it is going to be about games and how fun they are. And so the other thing I wanted to point out is like this revival of the podcast. We were kind of at around like an hour and a half to 2 hours, I think, in terms of a podcast. Like I was really wanting this push for long form content. But I think this podcast, not to say I might have a podcast where I talk for a few hours on a topic. I mean, it gets hard when you're doing a solo show. It's a lot. Those podcasts can stretch out in length when you have 3 other co-hosts to bounce ideas off of and have them share their perspectives. So the podcast is going to be a little bit shorter in terms of length. It's going to be in that half an hour to 45-minute range. And it's just going to be talking about like whatever I want to talk about. And, I think the first few episodes back, it's really going to be catching everyone up on what games I've been playing and talking about those games and, really just seeing how things flow week to week and seeing how it rides, Gosh, what can I update in terms of the last 5 years? I think in terms of games, not too much has changed. I'm primarily play on my PlayStation 5. I have a gaming PC, which has a little bit of a dated graphics card now. I'm hoping to upgrade that at some point. And I don't have a Switch 2. I don't have a Steam Deck. There's lots of new awesome things that are out there that I would love to have my hands on. But just because of the fact, like I mentioned earlier, games are expensive. I can't necessarily experience all the things I want to experience. So, some of those conversations on the show might be more niche or more focused to like what I'm doing or what I'm playing. And hopefully you're along the ride with me and having to hear about, what I've been doing in Marathon one week, or I've been recently playing Ghost of Yotei, and that's like a game that came out like several months ago. So it's going to be a little bit different in that sense. It's like if you expect me to come each week with like the greatest and latest news and video games that have come out, it's just that's not going to happen because that's not who I am anymore, right? I'm not somebody who is constantly buying the new releases. I'd love to, I'd like to drop and have bought, Resident Evil Requiem and Crimson Desert and Pragmata and have a Switch 2 and be playing Pocopia. And there's lots of people out there that do get to experience that, but I'm just not in that world right now. And so the show is going to be a little bit different in that sense. And like I mentioned earlier, there is going to be a bit of a focus on just games in general, not just video games. I've really gotten back into collecting TCG cards again. Back in like 2022 and 2021, like tail end of 2021, I really got back into collecting Yu-Gi-Oh cards. That was something that I collected when I was younger for many years. And I got back into that because there was kind of like this spike with like Yu-Gi-Oh and Pokemon during COVID. And so I got interested in it again. And I actually, in 2023, I like sold off my entire Yu-Gi-Oh collection. I had amassed like a huge collection of mostly Yu-Gi-Oh cards, a very small collection of Pokemon, because like it is today, Pokemon at that time was quite challenging to find like new products and stuff like that. And so I was really deep in that world. And then I actually stopped and I like sold off my entire collection, because I needed the money, and I sold off like all my Yu-Gi-Oh cards. I think I got like maybe like $3,700 or something like that for my entire, or no, sorry, it would be $4,200 for my entire Yu-Gi-Oh collection. And then I think I sold off my Pokemon collection for like $350. And I had to like step away from trading card games altogether because obviously there's a bit of gambling aspect into it when you're buying packs, and it can add up very quickly, and that was part of it. I felt like I was spending way too much money on these cards, and yeah, I couldn't come back to it because I knew it would be like opening a can of worms. But I spent enough time, a few years, not doing it to the point where I actually took the rest of my physical video game collection. So like my old Nintendo 64, my old PlayStation 2, all my retro games, all my physical games I had left. And I went into a local shop here that carries Epic Games and More. Shout out to them in Victoria, BC. They have a huge selection of like retro and up to like current gen video game stuff. And I just decided, I'm like, why do I still have this stuff? It's just like collecting dust. Some of it's actually just like been sitting in boxes for years and years and years. And it's like, there's so many ways for these games are really accessible in terms of like, some of them have been remade, or there's lots of emulators, and just like the technology behind emulation is just constantly evolving each day. And so I was like, if I really want to revisit any of these games, like there are ways to do that. So I basically brought in my full physical video game collection, and I traded it. And they also carry Pokemon, like sealed product, as well as a ton of like singles. And I traded in like almost $400 worth of product, and I had a store credit, and I created a collection of Pokemon cards. So I'm kind of a little bit back in that world of collecting cards again, but I definitely budget myself a lot more. It's a very small collection that continues to grow, but that's just an example of some of the things I might be talking about in the future. Like there might be some week where I talk exclusively about TCG, or the next week I might talk about a video game and give a review for an indie game that I'm playing or something like that. So there's going to be a bit of a wide range in terms of topics covered. So I hope that works out. If people want to listen to it, great. And if they don't, I really genuinely don't care. Like, I just wanted to have these discussions. I want to be on a microphone and just, like I did back in 2018, have that creative outlet where I talk about these things. So that's where I'm at. And I'd love to kind of like, in this episode, kind of break away from talking about, the structure of the podcast and the history of Games Are Fun. But I think this first podcast, I'm really just going to leave it as kind of like my comeback to kind of just explain, what happened, why I'm back, and, see where the show goes from there. So I just wanted to thank everyone for, listening to the show in its original run. And like I said at the top of the show, if you've come back to the podcast, thank you. I really appreciate you giving me another chance to hear what I have to say. And it feels great to kind of be able to talk on a podcast again. And I'm really excited to see where things go. That is going to do it for today's episode. Again, these episodes are going to be around half an hour to 45 minutes. That's what it's going to be. My plan is for weekly releases every Monday. So you can expect to kind of see that new episode in your feeds. That was one quick story before I sign off. And that is, I actually had a bit of a challenge in terms of recovering this podcast again, because when I launched this podcast back in the day, with podcasts, you have a hosting, you have a host for it, right? That hosts your RSS feed. And back in the day, I started on SoundCloud because that was one of the few free kind of hosting sites where you could, host a podcast from. And eventually I transitioned and went over to a platform called Anchor. And Anchor was really cool because it was this platform where they'd host your podcast and they would also distribute it to like all these podcast platforms. So, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, fucking Podbean or whatever it's called. There was like all these random podcast host sites. I mean, most people listened on like Apple or Google and, eventually Spotify when Spotify started getting podcasts. And it was a really cool tool. And so all the information was kind of linked in this Anchor account. And then Spotify actually purchased Anchor and turned Anchor into, I think it's called like Spotify for Creators or something like that. And so when I tried, like, I couldn't just like go to anchor.fm or whatever it was and like punch in my username and log in. I had to like figure out where that podcast was. But thankfully Spotify actually implemented this like recovery tool where you could like recover your old like Anchor account and kind of like turn it into a Spotify creator account. And so it was a little bit tricky. Like there was some email that it was attached to, the account was attached to, that I didn't have access to. And then it was a bit of a back and forth with support, but I was able to secure the feed. And so hopefully, I mean, I guess if you're listening to this on anything other than Spotify, that means it is working. It is being distributed out to the platforms, but I don't know really how all that works. I think the main platforms that the podcast will live on is Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And, we still back in the day, we did have a video version of our podcast where we'd be on Discord web camera and we would upload the episodes to YouTube. I don't think I'm going to be doing that with this show again. I think the Games Are Fun YouTube channel, it still exists. I've kind of archived some of those old episodes just for the sole purpose of Games Are Fun on YouTube is going to be something different, I think. It's going to be maybe short form content talking about specific video games or whatever, video essays. Who knows what it will be, but it will be like something that exists alongside the podcast. It's not going to be the podcast, just uploaded onto YouTube. I think I do want to kind of like separate them, but for now it is just going to be, me releasing the podcast on a weekly basis, audio only. And hopefully at some point, once I kind of shake off the rust, get back into the podcasting world, I can then put some time into figuring out video content again, because that is something that I think I really enjoyed doing. And I think it's a great way to connect with you guys, the listener, in having some sort of visual format there. And so that is planned for the future, but it's kind of, TBD right now in terms of what that's going to look like. So I just wanted to share that update that I secured the podcast, and hopefully all the subscribers, this new release has hit your feeds. Please, if you can, share this show with anyone who might be interested in a weekly video game podcast. It really means a lot when you guys share the show and even just like listen to it, subscribe, leave a rating, leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Those things go so far in today's world, because it's really tough to sometimes find an audience on these platforms when there's so many. Like, that's the other thing. Since I podcast, it felt like everybody like started a podcast, like especially during COVID, like everybody was doing a podcast. And I feel like some of those people have like phased out, but it's still a world where there's so many other shows you could go and listen to. So it would just mean a lot if you could do those extra things like subscribing to the show, follow the show, go to our Instagram at Games Are Fun. Games Are Fun. See, it's been so long since I plugged the show that I don't even remember the handles of all my socials. I gotta pull it up real quick so I can, because Instagram is kind of like Twitter's dead to me. I've deleted my Twitter years and years ago. Games Are Fun is not going to be on Twitter. I'm not going to have a Facebook page. It's going to be like, if you want to know what's going on with Games Are Fun, you got to have to look to the Instagram page. At some point, those of you who listened to the show previously would remember that we had a Discord. The Discord will come back at some point, but again, there's all these things that I kind of have to like take it slow, and it will try slowly kind of like build up again. And so, yeah, make sure you go over to Instagram at Games Are Fun Pod. Give us a follow. That's where the updates are going to be on when new episodes drop. And yeah, again, thank you guys for listening to this episode. It means a lot to be able to kind of just come on here and talk about, where things have been in the last 5 years. And I feel like I'll be doing a lot of catching up over the next several episodes. But I'm really excited to come back next week and talk to you guys about games and getting to the heart of, games are fun, and I'm here to talk about them. So thank you all for listening. I'll talk to you later.